The Great Depression is something we learn about in most every social studies class. You should have encountered it in the 8th and ninth grades. If I asked you what caused the Great Depression, I wouldn't be surprised if several of you said that the stock market crash of 1929 was the major cause. However, if you'll remember from a couple of weeks ago when we talked about World War I, the event that started everything, the assassination of Archduke Francis Ferdinand, wasn't the cause, it was the spark. Like World War I, the Great Depression was brewing long before the stock market crash. In this chapter, we will discuss the underlying causes of the Great Depression, the effect it had on families, and the early reactions of the government to fix the problems of the Great Depression. As I stated in the introduction to the chapter, the cause of the Great Depression began much earlier than 1929. Throughout the 1920s, despite the look of prosperity, specific industries that were vital to the survival of the United States economy were in big trouble. Railroad companies, textile factories, and steel manufacturers were barely turning a profit. Mining and lumber operations that grew during the war were no longer in high demand, which caused those businesses to suffer. The coal industry took a hit as new energy sources became available. This same thing is happening to coal today. This state has been dependent on coal for its power for a very long time. And in the last few years, the push for cleaner energy has led to a rise in energy prices and a lot of hostility towards the government at that. The automobile, construction, and consumer goods industries that had flourished in the early part of the 1920s began to weaken. The housing industry also began to decline. This is also part of why the stock market began to decline in 2008, among other things. During World War I, the whole world needed American grain. Since all of Europe was involved in fighting the war, they couldn't grow their own food and needed our crops. Farmers began to produce more to meet the growing demand. When the war ended, the demand for American crops declined, and as a result, the prices for American crops fell. Farmers decided to produce even more, hoping that they could sell more at lower prices and still be able to pay off debts. Terrible idea, by the way. Prices fell further, farmers couldn't pay back loans, and as a result, rural or small-town banks began to fail. The government did try to help by passing a law that would allow the government to buy surplus crops and guarantee prices for crops. But the Republican president, Calvin Coolidge, vetoed the bill because he felt the government wasn't supposed to help in this way. If you'll remember from the last chapter, the reason the economy looked as if it was thriving was because consumers were able to spend more money on things like cars and appliances, etc. Towards the end of the 1920s, American consumers had less money to spend because of higher prices due to inflation. Stagnant wages, which means they're not going up, and to buy all of these things, they wanted people bought on credit, which put them in debt. Credit is both a terrible and a necessary at the same time. Prior to the 1920s, most people only bought something if they could pay for it in full. During the 1920s, it became more socially acceptable for people to use credit, or buy now and pay later. Businesses were more than happy to give people a line of credit to buy something, and as a result, consumers began to pile up large amounts of debt. When wages remained the same and the price of everyday necessities went up, many consumers had trouble paying off their debts. To make it possible to pay their debts, consumers began to cut back on their spending, which hurt the economy. In recent years, the same problem has hurt our economy. Prior to 2008, mortgage companies were giving home loans to pretty much anybody that wanted one, even if it was questionable that they could afford it. On top of that, these same people would use credit cards to purchase clothes, appliances, groceries, pretty much everything. When the inevitable happened and a large number of people couldn't pay back their home loans or credit card debts, the stock market fell sharply. After that, the mortgage and credit card companies stopped giving loans as easily. When they did this, consumer spending declined and the economy fell further. We are still working to fix these problems today. If we're supposed to learn from our history, then why did the same thing that caused the Great Depression happen again 80 years later? Yeah, I know, greed. To make matters worse, the income gap in the United States during the 1920s was quite large. 70% of families in the United States earned less than what was necessary to live a decent life. Most of the population couldn't afford all these products that made it look like our economy was doing so great. We talk about this same issue today. During the 2012 presidential election, it was known as the 1% versus the 95%. Basically, that meant rich versus poor. In the election of 1928, the Republican candidate Herbert Hoover wins fairly easily. His overwhelming victory shows that the American public is happy with the direction the two previous Republican presidents had taken the country. During that period of Republican control in the 1920s, the stock market rose steadily. The way we keep track of the growth of the stock market is by looking at the Dow Jones Industrial Average. We still use the same thing today. The stock market provided an opportunity for individuals to get rich very quickly. During the 1920s, people would buy stock and bonds using speculation. They would buy cheap stocks with the idea that they would rise in value and could be sold for a profit. Not a huge problem if you're risking money you already have, but during the 1920s, it became popular to buy on margin. Buying on margin means that you get a loan for an amount of stock that you want to buy with no way to pay it off unless the stock increases in value. People would buy stocks with borrowed money, and when the stock had increased in value enough, they would sell it and pay off the debt, then keep the rest as pure profit. This sounds like a great idea because you can make money without ever having to risk your own. The problem comes in when the stock market loses value instead, and you can't afford to pay off your debt. Then you and the bank you borrowed from are in trouble. If this happens to enough people, the whole economic system of the United States is put at risk. That risk comes to a head in September of 1929. In early September, the stock market peaks or reaches its highest point, and then begins to fall. Investors are selling their stock at a higher rate than ever before. They're trying to get rid of stocks before the value falls too far so that they can minimize their losses. This gradual fall continues until Thursday, October 24th. On the 24th, investors started rapidly selling off what stocks they own. As a result, the Dow Jones Industrial Average begins to plummet. On Friday, the sell-off continues and some begin to worry. Over the weekend, investors pull their money together and try to buy back some of the stocks in order to hold off a crash. However, the buyback was too little too late. On Tuesday, October 29th, also known as Black Tuesday, the stock market crashes. And along with the massive amounts of money lost that day, confidence in the American economy also falls. Banks lose money and begin calling on their customers to pay off debts that they don't have the money to pay for. And before long, banks close, and people who had never even thought about buying stocks lose every bit of their life savings. Thankfully, today we have something to protect us from losing our life savings if the bank we put our money in closes its doors. We'll talk about what that is in the next chapter. But in 1929, there was no safety net. People lost everything. The period from 1929 to 1940 is known to everyone as the Great Depression. The economy bottoms out. Unemployment goes up to as high as 25%. Compare this to about a 6 to 7% unemployment rate today. The crash causes people to panic and they run to the banks to get their money out. The problem is banks don't keep all the money deposited in them in cash. When everybody goes to get their money, the banks don't have it and they have to close. We call this a bank failure. This happens because banks use your money to invest in the stock market. When the stock market crashed, they lost their customers' money as well as their own. By 1933, the amount of goods and services produced in the United States, also known as the Gross National Product, or GNP, is cut in half. Just look at the number of businesses that go bankrupt. If 90,000 businesses have to close their operations, we obviously can't produce at the same level we did before. By 1933, 25%, or 1 in 4, of the people in the United States are without a job. Those that do have a job have to take pay cuts and work less hours. Almost the exact same thing happened a few years ago, except the unemployment rate only got to about 12%, which is still pretty bad. All the other problems happened as well. Banks closed. Despite that, people were able to keep their savings because of something we will talk about later. Our GNP fell, just not by half. And the people that did have jobs were forced to take pay cuts or hour cuts. Again, I ask, how in the world did we let this happen? The United States was not the only country affected by the Great Depression. This is mainly because the entire world's economy had become intertwined as a result of World War I. When the Depression hit the United States, they were unable to afford the importation of goods from Europe. In an effort to make sure people in the United States only purchased American-made goods, the government passed something called the Hawley-Smoot Tariff. The tariff was meant to make goods from outside the United States cost so much that the only affordable products were American-made. The problem with this is that other countries are only able to acquire American money through trade with the United States. If the tariff keeps Americans from buying foreign goods, it also keeps foreigners from buying American goods. This makes it impossible for foreign nations like Germany, Great Britain, and France to pay off their war debts. As a result, International trade slows to a standstill, and economies all over the world crumble. The income gap, or the availability of easy credit, farm problems, tariffs, and war debts are all causes of the Great Depression, not just the stock market crash of 1929. The Great Depression is so much more than how much money was lost, the unemployment rate, or why it happened. The Great Depression's effect on everyday ordinary people is much more important than all of that. History is all about learning from mistakes. If people were to really focus on what people had to do to survive each and every day during the Depression, I am certain that we would find a way to solve our problems. 1 in 4 people in this country were without a job during the early years of the Great Depression. Without a job, people lose their houses or are evicted from their apartments. One of the most basic human needs is shelter from the elements. When people lost their homes or apartments, they sought any shelter they could find. People in the cities built shanty towns in open areas of the city. These towns are built with whatever material is available, pieces of wood, sheets of metal, cardboard, fabric, whatever else will work. To find food, people would dig through trash or stand on the street to beg for handouts. I know all of you are probably thinking that you would never do that, but I promise if you're hungry enough, you would. My grandfather used to tell us, if you're hungry enough, you'll eat the bark off of a tree. And I've always taken that to mean that when push comes to shove, you'll do whatever is necessary to keep your stomach and those of your families from constantly rumbling and hungry. Some charities also ran soup kitchens or bread lines. Soup kitchens and bread lines are places for the poor to go get cheap or free meals. People would line up down the street for small bits of soup and bread. One of the most devastating things to remember about the Depression is the effect on minorities. African Americans faced 50% unemployment rate. Remember, the overall national unemployment rate is at 25%. It was hard for African Americans and Latinos to find work in the best of times, much less when the jobs they normally fill, because white people don't want that job, are being taken by whites who will take any job. The Depression in rural areas, or the country, if you don't remember what that means, was quite different. Hunger was not as much an issue for farmers because they could grow their own food. One of the biggest issues for farmers was losing the farm because of falling crop prices and debt issues that we discussed in Section 1. When farmers lost their farms, they had to become tenant farmers. A tenant farmer is a farmer that works and lives on a farm that someone else owns. To make matters worse, the weather during the 1930s, coupled with poor farming practices, led to an environmental catastrophe known as the Dust Bowl. Farmers in the Great Plains helped bring about this disaster through overproduction. In farming, you have to plant something different each season. If you plant something that diminishes the soil quality each and every season, eventually the soil will not be good enough for planting. Because of this, the soil in the Great Plains basically turned to dust when rain stopped. When the winds picked up, dust storms swallowed up the Great Plains. I heard a story one time that dust from the Great Plains was found to have settled on a ship in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. When the farms of the Great Plains literally dried up, farmers migrated to the west to find work. When I was in high school, I had to read a novel by John Steinbeck, which is the same guy that wrote Mice of Men, called The Grapes of Wrath. The book is fairly boring, but it does do a good job of telling the story of migrant farmers during the Great Depression. You may want to pick it up and read it one day. I truly hope none of you had to experience what I'm about to talk about, but I'm not naive enough to think that all of you have ideal family lives. Each and every one of us rely on our family for stability. The most stressful issue in each and every family revolves around money. When families have money issues that are as unsolvable as they were during the Depression, the strain frequently breaks families apart. During the Great Depression, men had a very rough time. Men were used to and felt like they were supposed to support their families. When they lost their jobs and could not find another, they would often feel like they had failed their families. Some men felt so ashamed they could not find a job that they would not leave the house because they feared being seen during normal working hours. I can relate to this feeling. The entire time I was going to school, I felt ashamed to be at home when most others were at work. I wasn't making much money, I was working a degrading job, and I was sometimes embarrassed to be seen at work. I found solace in the fact that I was working toward a degree. I can only imagine how terrible men during the Depression felt, having so little to look forward to. In today's world, if we really need help, we can get it from the government through direct relief, or as we know it today, welfare. During the early part of the Depression, no direct relief was available. Women didn't have it easy during the Depression, that's for sure. Women had to go back to sewing clothes and canning food. These are things that have become part of the past, but out of necessity, women had to resume those activities in order to survive. Some women were ashamed to stand in lines for bread and soup. When women could get a job, men hated them for it. Some women had to lie about their marital status because if they were married to a man with a job, they would be fired, so that someone without another income could have their job. The worst part of the Depression for women is having to see their children starve and suffer. Due to reduced consumer spending, the government collected fewer tax dollars. Because of the reduced tax revenue, schools weren't open as long, and some even closed. This led to a much less educated generation. Without schools to go to, and parents with very little money to even feed themselves, some teenagers had to leave their homes. Some just jumped on trains and rode the rails looking for adventure and work. Anytime the unemployment rate rises, so does the suicide rate. People feel like there's no possible way out and choose to take their own life instead of endure the struggle. If you ask me, I feel like this is the most selfish thing anyone can do. Taking your own life doesn't just affect you, it affects everyone in your life. If you ever feel down and depressed enough to contemplate suicide, please talk to someone. One of the greatest things to come out of the Great Depression is the help people gave to each other. You can't get through this life alone. It takes others to help you along. Also, people who lived through the Great Depression develop a habit of thriftiness or saving. These are the people that bury jars of money in the backyard, hide money in their mattresses because they're afraid to put it in the bank. These people also pay cash for everything and hate credit cards. So far, we've discussed the causes of the Great Depression, how the Depression affected everyday Americans. In this section, we're going to explore the government's initial reaction to the Depression. The president in 1929 was Republican Herbert Hoover. All the way at the beginning of this chapter, I told you that he was elected in 1928 because the country seemed to be pleased with the direction the two previous Republican presidents had taken the nation. He is inaugurated in March of 1929, and by the end of that year, unemployment was skyrocketing and the economy was collapsing. Though it wasn't his fault it began, the country expects him to be the problem solver. His reaction will not be enough to make the millions of struggling Americans happy. Shortly after the crash on Black Tuesday, Herbert Hoover attempted to reassure the nation that the economy was sound. He wasn't the only person that felt this way. Economists then and now believe that depressions are simply part of the business cycle. If we were to look at the economy of the United States in graph form, it would look much like this over its entire history. The economy is neither always good nor always bad. The economists at the time thought the crash was simply part of a recession. They knew things needed to be fixed, but they didn't expect a depression that would last more than a decade. Hoover was a conservative Republican. As such, he felt that the government of the United States had no business regulating business. He thought that the government's place in all of this was to bring people together and foster the cooperation necessary to fix the economy. He also felt that the people of the United States should take care of themselves. He felt it wasn't the government's responsibility to feed and clothe the poor and hungry. How do you think that's going to fly with the struggling masses? Hoover brings businesses, banking, and labor leaders together in order to fix the issues facing the economy. Since he felt that it wasn't the government's responsibility to help the poor with direct aid, he worked to help private charities raise funds to help the needy. The problem here should be obvious. The economy was tanking. There wasn't much money out there to be raised. Private charities were not going to be able to gather enough money to help all the people that needed help. Hoover did try to provide a few jobs. In an effort to provide a lot of good-paying jobs, the government spent money to build the Boulder Dam on the Colorado River. We now call this the Hoover Dam because it was commissioned during Hoover's presidency. Most, if not all of you, know what dam I'm speaking of. This is the dam that hid the Allspark and Megatron in the first Transformers. The Hoover Dam's real purpose is to provide water, flood control, and power to the areas around the Hoover Dam. Despite his efforts, Hoover and the Republicans were not able to do enough to make the public happy. just 2 years after the people of the United States had emphatically voted in Hoover because they were happy with the direction the Republicans had taken the country. Voters elected a Democratic majority in the House and cut the Senate majority to a single vote. The criticism of Hoover went so far that people began calling the shanty towns we spoke at the very beginning of the chapter Hoovervilles. Hoover continued to try. He worked with farmers to set up cooperatives that would control the supply of crops in an attempt to raise prices. Congress also began to work towards fixing the economy. They passed the Federal Home Loan Bank Act, which lowered mortgage interest rates in an attempt to make it easier for individuals to get home loans. Lower interest rates would make it easier to afford paying back a home loan. Congress also created the Reconstruction Finance Corporation that was designed to loan money to businesses. This is actually a decent idea, but most individuals saw this as the government helping the rich, not the poor. The same tactic was used in our recent economic struggles. The government gave what came to be known as bailouts to banks, insurance companies, and car manufacturers in order to stabilize the economy. Critics of those bailouts argued that these bailouts only made the wealthy more money, while everyday ordinary individuals struggled to pay for basic necessities. Unfortunately for Hoover, the economy didn't improve enough to make a difference. If the economy wasn't enough to make sure Hoover would not get reelected, the Bonus Army incident was definitely the straw that broke the camel's back. World War I veterans went to Washington, D.C. to support a bill that would pay them a bonus they were promised early. They were originally set to receive the bonus in I think 1941, but due to the economic issues, they felt they deserved it early. Hoover opposed the bill, and the Republican Senate voted down the bill. Most of the veterans left the Capitol, but there were about 2,000 that decided to stay in order to speak to the president. Hoover was afraid that the remaining veterans would resort to violence, so he ordered the Army to disband the Bonus Army. The Army used tear gas to get the Bonus Army to leave. Now think about this for a second. Could you imagine how mad the general public would be if President Obama ordered the Army to use force to disband a protest of veterans? The decision to use force to remove the Bonus Army was the last straw for Hoover.